Greetings. Chapter 9 addresses pedophilia and psychological profiling, so we will address child sex abusers in this particular segment. First, if we look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the current edition, the 4th edition text revision, we find the definition or the diagnosis focusing on over a period of at least 6 months, recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies, sexual urges, or behaviors involving sexual activity with a prepubescent child or children, generally 13 age or younger. The second criteria, the person has acted on these sexual urges, or the sexual urges or fantasies cause marked distress or interpersonal difficulty. And the third criteria, the person is at least 16 years of age and at least 5 years older than the child or children in criterion A. And this comes right out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual Mental Disorders. So you can see that there would be a large proportion of those that molest children that may not fit the diagnosis of pedophilia. And there's certain types that would be attracted to prepubescent children who we would tend to diagnose if they met the criteria as pedophiles. But then there's those that are attracted to pubescent children, generally teens, young teens, and that particular category of individuals would be labeled hebephilic type. And then that is important to differentiate from the pedophiles. So often you hear about a pedophile in the press when they're sexually abusing a 15-year-old. They're more likely to be a hebephile. If we start looking at the child molester types and get into the typologies, we see that they're situational abusers who tend to abuse when stressed and may have fewer victims, the regressed, the sexually indiscriminate, and the naive or inadequate. So let's focus on these for a moment. The regressed turns to children as a substitute sexual partner, often precipitated by some stress like divorce or job loss or some kind of blow to their ego. The morally indiscriminate likes to try out a variety of sexual behaviors, and so they will use people and they look for opportunities to abuse. The naive or inadequate may have major mental disorders or impairments, and part of that may lead to their sexually abusive behaviors. The preferential prefers children as sexual partners, and two types are discussed in your textbook. The misoped child molester, the sadistic, really, child molester who finds it sexually arousing to harm, torture, and kill children, and then the fixated, that does not want to harm the child but wants to form a relationship and tends to stray away from relationships with adults. And so you can see the differences there. With the fixated, their sexual orientation really is to children, that they are kind of stuck developmentally in a state where their sexual partners and in fact their friends tend to be children. So you might see this where everything seems normal. The kid is 10 or 11, has friends that are 10 or 11. Well, when the kid's 14, they still have 10, 11-year-old friends. When they're 19, they still have 10, 11-year-old friends. And if they become sexually abusive, this would certainly fall under the fixated category. And you can see that there's typologies in your textbook that look at the immature, naive, regressed, sadistic, and fixated, and the levels of harm to the child as far as physical injury, aggressive personality, antisocial personality, child preference, whether they know the child or not, if intercourse occurs, and so on. I think one thing that's interesting to note is that often there's not physical injury in child sexual abuse cases, and that is important to recognize. Also, I briefly point out that there are sex offender strategies that are used, some common strategies and themes and methods that sex offenders use, and this comes under the criminal events perspective discussed in Young's work. The use of normalization as a strategy in sexual exploitation of children by adult offenders, from the Canadian Journal of Human Sexuality, Volume 6, back in 1997. A very relevant article looking at how the crime happens and how it continues undetected, and basically looking at the ordinary lifestyles and events and routines of daily activities that the sex offender may focus on their family being a private group. They may play games that lead to sexually abusive behavior. They may try to integrate sexually abusive behavior into caretaking and socialization activities. They may also engage in giving gifts and trying to present that the behavior is normal and so on. And we see that in a lot of cases as well. If you look at some of the cases that are currently in the media, often you'll find that there's a grooming process that is discussed, how the offender gained that child's trust and then broke it, and started off in a friendship mode that became inappropriate, sexually abusive, criminal behavior. I also wanted to mention a few myths about sex abuse and sex offenders. One myth is that sex offenders tend to be older men. Well, they may be, but a significant proportion of sex offenders start offending in their teenage years. Sex offenders are usually frustrated with no sexual outlets. Many times they have relationships, they may be married, they certainly have access to a variety of sexual outlets. Sex offenders are usually strangers. Most of the time they're not. They're known to the victim. The perpetrator and the victim know each other, either through family connections or through friends, acquaintances, or some type of social institution. Sex offenders abuse due to their own childhood sexual abuse victimization. What we find is there's a small increased risk, but relatively small, and overall I think it would be safe to say that a vast majority of those that have been sexually abused and victimized do not grow up to sexually offend. Do not. Sex offenders have a hormonal imbalance. We haven't found any evidence of that. Sex offenders are addicted to drugs and alcohol, and that causes the offense. No. They may use drugs and alcohol to loosen inhibitions. Sex offenders cannot be treated. Actually, we see that treatment can reduce recidivism. Male sex offenders that sexually abuse male children are homosexual? Not necessarily, and often we find that's not the case. Sex offenders are usually psychotic or insane? Rarely. Sexual abuse by females is extremely rare, even though, and no, actually it occurs, and a higher frequency than we would probably be led to believe from media and press reports. But certainly males are more likely to be sex offenders, but a significant proportion of females also sexually abuse children. And these cases may be less likely to come to the attention of professionals. Violence is often used during sexually abusive act, very often not the case. There's often medical evidence of sexual abuse due to injury, again, usually not. Many adolescents make up stories about sexual abuse due to their overactive imagination. Usually not. Some may make up stories, but it's relatively rare. Much of the cases that are reported are verified, and if it's, of course, it's often difficult to try these cases in court, but certainly the children's descriptions, depictions, and reporting seems to be relatively valid in a majority of cases. Boys who are sexually abused by older women are rarely harmed. That is clearly false. Sex offender registration helps the community safe. There's much debate about that, but many researchers say no, it doesn't. Sex offenders are similar. No, actually, they're very different. And this wraps up this video.